to proclaiming. Proclaiming is a wonderful thing. We should proclaim our faith, but apologetics gets into reasoning. Paul reasoned with them, it says in Acts chapter 17, from the scriptures and gave evidence to them that Jesus was the Christ. And that's what apologetics is all about. We don't have blind faith, do we? Like we get accused of sometimes. But in reality, our faith is very much a partner or a companion of reason. And so we believe the things that we believe because there's evidence that supports it, and we know it's true. Now, I like to deal with apologetics dealing primarily with the three pillars of Christianity. God is our creator, the Bible is God's word, and Jesus Christ is who the Bible says he is. There's more than that you can deal with in apologetics, but these are the areas that God's laid on my heart to try to help people become firm in why we believe these things. Because if you get solid in these three areas and can communicate to people why you believe what you believe, you're well on your way to being able to defend your faith, even though they may get off into some philosophy or something, a question that you don't have an answer for. And by the way, it's okay sometimes to just say, I don't know. That you haven't lost the conversation, the opportunity to minister to somebody if sometime you have to just say, I don't know. Because even in the things that we talk about today, after today, you're not going to have all the answers, and you'll forget some of the things that you hear. But it's okay. You have things to fall back on and say, I'll look into that and get back to you on that. So don't feel like in order to talk with people and use apologetics, you have to have all the answers. Now, we're dealing with a culture where there's a Goliath in our culture. In David's day, there was a 9-foot 9-inch warrior who stood on the battlefield and intimidated God's people to the point they were crippled in fear. And until David showed up, a young man who had been spending a lot of time with God and knew something that we read about in the New Testament: greater is he who lives within us than he that is in the world. But today, there's not a 9-foot 9-inch soldier on a battlefield somewhere, but there are people with PhDs behind their name, and there's intimidating forces throughout the culture that basically says to the church, you better keep that stuff inside the church. Because if you bring it out into the marketplace and into the real world, you're going down. Because we've got more intellect than you do, and we've got the evidence on our side. And it's a lie of the enemy. And just like in David's day, once David stood up to Goliath, God brought forth a great victory. And when the church realizes the evidence is really on our side and begins to stand up to this Goliath, we will see some great victories in our culture, and especially among our young people. So it's important that we equip ourselves, though. So I mentioned our young people. This book is one of many that's been written to reveal something that's going on in the culture. It says students leave faith behind primarily because of intellectual doubt and skepticism, and they've left the faith in great numbers. Some research says more than half of young people that grow up in the church walk away from their faith by the time they're done with college because of intellectual faith or intellectual doubt and skepticism that is fueled by things around them in the culture. That's why we need to focus on the types of things that we're talking about today within the local church. So faith and reason, some in the culture, loud voices say, hey, you got to choose one or the other. They don't go together. But in reality, they're wonderful companions. Reason means this: a faculty of the mind by which it distinguishes truth from falsehood and good from evil, and which enables the possessor to deduce inferences from facts or propositions. Reason is related to logic. I already mentioned Acts 17. Paul used reason and gave evidence to them to help people come to know Christ. It's a wonderful thing. It's something that we need in our Christian faith. But faith is not an enemy of reason. Faith means this: faith is in general the persuasion of the mind that a certain statement is true. Its primary idea is trust. A thing is true and therefore worthy of trust. It admits of many degrees up to full assurance of faith in accordance with the evidence on which it rests. So faith is not in opposition to evidence. It is strengthened by evidence. So really, both faith and reason deal with evidence and their companions, and that's the way it should be in our life. Jonathan Edwards, the great preacher in the first Great Awakening in America, talked about the need that God wants to reach the heart, but he doesn't bypass the mind in doing so, and that he uses reason to reach the hearts of people. So today we're going to be dealing with these kinds of things and seeing that it's actually exciting when you begin to see the evidence that confirms our faith. And by the way, I hope that you will agree with me by the end of the day. Some people think, well, apologetics may be needed, but man, it's boring. And I hope today that you will see it can also be exciting. That when you begin to see the stuff that God has done, and you begin to dwell upon, wow, he is an awesome God who's done mighty things, that we're going to see those kinds of things. I hope that you find it to be exciting. Now, the first part of this isn't quite as exciting, but it's necessary that we deal with to see the flaws of the theory of evolution, because that's been so promoted in our culture, that's ate away at the underpinnings of Christianity. And so we need to look at that first. In this first session, we're going to also be talking about, for a moment, are science and the Bible against each other? We hear that in our culture, don't we? People that say, well, science has disproved the Bible, and science has made faith in God to not be necessary anymore, and as though they are in composition. But actually, when you begin to look at science, you realize all the founders of science, whether it's Newton or Bacon or Francis Bacon or Kepler or Gregor Mendel or Nicholas Copernicus, or all of these founders of various areas of science, were all believers in God. And they begin to study science with the understanding that it's worth studying because we expect to find things that are ordered and that are reasonable and rational because it's been created by an intelligent God. Why would you even study the universe if it's just the result of an explosion with no rhyme or reason to it and no laws that would be established in it? And so they begin to study science because of their belief in God. And even today, some might say, well, that might have been true at the beginning, but today scientists don't believe in God and don't believe in the Bible if they're a true scientist. Well, you can go to this website, descentfromdarwin.org, and there's this statement and a list you can download. I've done this before. It's a multi-page list of scientists from around the world who have signed their name to this statement. We are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence of Darwinian theory should be encouraged. In other words, they're saying we don't really buy it. We're not convinced that this is true. And this document is signed by over 1,100 scientists in the world. Now, that doesn't mean there's only 1,100 scientists that question evolution. That means there's 1,100 of them that have had the courage, even knowing they could be putting their job in jeopardy in some cases, but they've had the courage to say, I'm going to sign this and let people know that scientists around the world who work in major universities, many of them, are not all sold on the idea of evolution being scientifically sound. So let's look at the flaws of the theory of evolution this morning. I want to give you 6 of them. Number 1 is the theory of evolution violates the second law of thermodynamics. What does that mean? Well, that means that the amount of usable energy in any closed system always decreases. That's a scientific law that's been established. There's the first law of thermodynamics, and this is the second law of thermodynamics. In other words, it means this: things move from order to chaos. They fall apart. We are all examples of entropy, is what the second law of thermodynamics is referring to. Entropy means this: things tend to gradually fall apart. My body is not the same as it was when I was 20 years old. I'm experiencing entropy. Stars burn out. If you take a new car and you put it in your driveway and think, well, I'm just going to leave it sit here for about 20 years. I think it'll be better 20 years from now. Is that going to work? No. We see entropy everywhere. The amount of usable energy in any closed system always goes from the amount of usable energy decreases. Things fall apart. Well, what does evolution say? It's based on this basic theory that there was an explosion 13.8 billion years ago called the Big Bang. So there was no order at all. Can you imagine? You can't find any order in the midst of an explosion. And yet what we look at today, 13.8 billion years later, according to their terms, we see a finely tuned universe we're going to talk about in a little bit, where it's amazingly ordered. As we will see later today, it's incredibly ordered, that to numbers that are undeniable, pointing to a designer or a creator. So the theory of evolution says we started with chaos and it's on its own, it's ordered itself, and now it's wonderfully ordered and finely tuned. That violates a scientific law. So the second one, let's move on to number 2. The theory of evolution violates the law of biogenesis. What is that? That is this simply that life only comes from life. It's been disproven, the idea of spontaneous generation, which would be life coming from non-life. That's been disproven, and the law of biogenesis has been established firmly within the scientific community. People like Louis Pasteur was very important in his research in helping to establish this as a scientific law. But what does evolution say? So this is from a documentary called Mankind Rising. You can go to YouTube, you can watch it. They got great computer graphics. If they would just put on there at the beginning, this is a Disney program for kids, it would be great, because it sounds like a fairy tale all the way through it, but it's very well done. But here's how they say life came. Remember, the science says life only comes from life. Here's what they say. A chain of events that defies the laws of probability 4 billion years ago here on Earth started, and nobody knows exactly how or where life began, but it couldn't happen without water. Asteroids or comets delivered it, that is water, here to the earth. The water is churning with chemicals and organic compounds. Lightning strikes the chemical soup at the right place at the right time. The chemicals atoms join up in a precise sequence, creating a bundle of genetic material. Luck strikes again. A blob of oily material engulfs a single chain to create the first ever cell. Now the genes send out messages, chemical instructions, and 3.5 billion years ago, they do something extraordinary. They copy themselves. This is the very first living thing. Now, yeah. That doesn't sound very scientific, does it? But that's what evolution says, how life began here on earth, and yet science says life only comes from life. True science, life only comes from life. Now, even other scientists have acknowledged this. This is Dr. Michael Denton. He says, considering the way the prebiotic soup is referred to in so many discussions of the origin of life as an already established reality, it comes as something of a shock to realize that there is absolutely no positive evidence for its existence. Even Dr. Francis Crick, who won a Nobel Prize for he and Dr. James Watson discovering the formation of the DNA molecule, he was a brilliant man, but in his finding of how complicated DNA was and the cellular level of life, he made this statement: you would be more likely to assemble a fully functioning and flying jumbo jet by passing a hurricane through a junkyard than you would be to assemble the DNA molecule by chance. In his book called Life Itself, Its Origin, I have this book in my library, he goes through mathematical probability of how impossible it would be for life to come from non-life here on earth because it's so complicated at its very cellular level and at the level of DNA. So you might be thinking, oh, well, that's great. Did Francis Crick come to become a believer in God since he knew that life was too complicated to come about by chance without coming from life? No, he came up with a theory called directed panspermia. Now, what in the world could that be? He says, given the weaknesses of all theories of terrestrial genesis, directed panspermia, the deliberate planting of life on Earth by aliens, should still be considered a serious possibility. So he would be among those that say, there's no way you could believe God did it. But aliens, yeah, that might be a reality. And then people like Richard Dawkins are proponents of directed panspermia. But notice they're acknowledging life is too complicated to have come from non-life in a prebiotic soup. But they don't want to acknowledge the reality, the obvious, that God has given us life. Life did not evolve from non-life. So that's number two. Life only comes from life, as opposed to what the theory of evolution says. Now, number three, the theory of evolution purposely confuses microevolution with macroevolution. Microevolution is simply adaptation within a kind. It's real. Creation scientists believe it just as much as evolutionary scientists believe it. That's why we can breed dogs, because there's wiggle room within the DNA of any creature. That's why human beings have different skin tones and different eye colors and different hair colors and stuff. There's wiggle room within that DNA, but you can't take one kind and turn it into another kind. There's boundaries. Macroevolution says, well, you can just extrapolate this out, these various little adaptations, and you can assume that one kind of creature can become a whole different type of creature. That's macroevolution. And so they try to teach evolution based on using microevolution examples to say macroevolution is true. Let me give you some examples of this. Darwin's finches. This is in textbooks. What did Darwin see? He observed that based on the environment that these beaks of these finches would be altered and change over a period of some generations. And he said, look at there, we're watching evolution occur. But do you know, at the end of his research, do you know what those finches became? Finches. Nothing else but finches. Then some textbooks talk about peppered moths. It's supposed to be great examples of natural selection. When you put light peppered moths on dark colored trees, they get eaten a lot easier than the dark peppered moths. But then when the soot and stuff would come, or excuse me, I got it backward. When the soot comes, they get dark. But when the soot was removed, and like birch trees and stuff where there was white background, the dark ones would get eaten more. And they said, see, we're seeing natural selection right here. This is an example of evolution. You know what the peppered moths became at the end of all the experiments? Peppered moths. Nothing other than that. Then they talk about bacteria in the laboratory that becomes resistant to antibiotics over a period of time, and they say we're watching from one generation of bacteria. After a few generations, they develop this immunity, and so we're watching evolution happen right in the laboratory. But you already know where I'm going with this. What did the bacteria become? Bacteria, nothing other than that. And then they have a whole website on stickleback fish, that freshwater and saltwater types, and how quickly they can adapt to their environment when they're placed in a new environment. But at the end of the day, the stickleback fish were still stickleback fish. These are the best examples they can come up with where we can see evolution. And none of them are examples of macroevolution. Matter of fact, we've never seen that. This is Dr. Dean Kenyon. He wrote the book on chemical evolution that was used across America back in the 1960s. And yet then he, through deeper research, walked away from that. And he acknowledges this. He said, let us dispose of a common misconception. The complete transmutation of even one animal species into a different species has never been directly observed either in the laboratory or in the field. Now I want to show you a little video clip here that where Ray Comfort is interviewing a number of college professors and college students about this issue, asking them, can you give me one example where we have been able to observe macroevolution, one kind turning into another, and listen to their answers.
I have faith in the experts knowing what they're talking about.
The scientific method must be observable and repeatable. So could you give me one piece of observable evidence for Darwinian evolution?
Okay, I would point to, as one great example is look at the genetics of the stickleback.
What's that?
So stickleback fish are a very interesting collection of species that were recently isolated after the end of the Ice Age.
What did they become?
They're various species of sticklebacks.
They stayed as fish.
Well, of course.
Can you think of any observable evidence where there was a change of kinds?
Fish.
Human beings are still fish.
Human beings are fish?
Why, yes, of course they are.
How long did that take?
A couple billions of years, millions.
A couple of millions? How is that observable?
It's not.
We came out of the ground as a mammal, and one mammal created...
Come out of the ground? Didn't we come out of the sea?
Huh? Well, initially in the beginning, we came out of the ground and the sea. After the great destruction of the...
So did we have lungs or gills when we came out of the sea?
You want to know something? Those that were in the sea, I guess, had gills, and those that were on land had lungs.
But if we came out of the sea, we had gills in the sea.
You want to know something? Who knows that we came out of the sea or we evolved from mammals?
So you don't know?
Huh? Of course I don't know.
I'm accepting that they did their science correctly.
Could you give me an example of Darwinian evolution, not adaptation or speciation, but a change of kinds?
These are changes of kinds.
They're still fish.
They're distinctly different fish.
We have thousands of examples.
Can you give me one?
I can give you thousands.
Just one.
For instance, I would say look at Lenski's experiments with bacteria then.
So what do the bacteria become?
The bacteria are still bacteria, of course.
That's not Darwinian evolution. That's not a change of kinds, is it?
It is a change. It is a change in the genetic makeup of the bacteria, which
They're
is
still bacteria. So what do the bacteria become?
A new kind of bacteria.
So it's still bacteria. There's no change of kinds. To summarize, the observable evidence that you give me for Darwinian evolution is bacteria becoming bacteria.
No, it is bacteria acquiring new metabolic capability.
These are people teaching in major universities, and in their mind, they think these are really good examples. They're not acknowledging, they're not seeing one kind turning into another kind. All they're seeing is something God has allowed in every form of life, this little adaptation within a kind. But there's direct boundaries related to that. Now let's move on to number 4. And we're going to talk about that it contradicts the fossil record. So there should be millions, if not billions, of examples of transitional life forms found in the fossil record if evolution had been occurring throughout the history of the world. And some in faith point to this as verifying evidence of evolution. But let's look at some of the quotes by even Darwin himself and others. So back in 1859, Darwin said this: "Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record." In other words, we don't find these in the fossils, but it's just that we haven't had time to find enough fossils yet. So let's fast forward 120 years. Dr. David Raup says, well, we are now about 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. The record of evolution is still surprisingly jerky, and ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. Some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. We went backward. This is Dr. Stephen Jay Gould from Harvard. He says all paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt. Then he says in another article, the absence of the fossil record or fossil evidence for intermediary changes between major transitions in organic design, indeed our ability even in our imagination to construct functional intermediates in many cases has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. Now, this is Dr. Colin Patterson. He wrote a book related to these issues, and he didn't put any examples of micro or macroevolution found in the fossil record. And so a Christian man wrote him a letter and said, why didn't you use any examples in your book? He wrote him back, and this is what he said: I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would have certainly included them. Yet Gould and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional forms. I'll lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. Pretty convincing, isn't it? And yet it goes further. In 2018, this is a very recent article, they begin to study the DNA in some of these fossils. It says, in analyzing the barcodes across 100,000 species, the researchers found a telltale sign showing that almost all the animals emerged about the same time as humans. Does that make you think of anything? Like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This same article goes on to say this: in yet another unexpected finding from the study, species have very clear genetic boundaries, and there's nothing much in between. We don't find these gradual transitions. We find very bounded, this kind of creature. Now, you got within the dog kind, you've got species and the cat kind, but you can't find a way to cross between one kind and another. And yet, young people go to science museums, natural museums and stuff, field museums, and they find this kind of thing. This is supposed to be a feathered dinosaur where dinosaurs were becoming birds, and this is an intermediate form. But they never found this underground. This is what they found underground. And they made that for kids to see. You see the artistic liberties that they take to show people what they want them to believe. Another part of this whole thing of the fossils goes back to in this whole thing of, well, where are the links between ape and man? And one of the famous links between was called Nebraska man. This was a big discovery back in many decades ago. And so they found this fossil, and then this is what the artist came up with of what Nebraska man looked like. And so that was in the textbooks as one of the links between apes and men. So you wonder, well, what was the fossil they found to come up with this picture of what Nebraska man looked like? That's the fossil there that they found. It was a tooth. And they developed a whole picture from that. And then through further research, they found out that tooth came from an extinct pig. Nebraska man was dropped out of the textbooks. But it's an example of how there's a real problem when you're trying to prove something that's just not true. The fossil record does not confirm evolution. Number 5, The theory of evolution contradicts the fact that mutations do not bring increased genetic information. Now, if you study evolution at all, you find that mutations are supposed to be the engine. This article said that mutation is the engine of evolution, in that it generates the genetic variation on which the evolutionary process depends. Genetic variation is a prerequisite to evolutionary change. So you got to have mutations. That's the engine that drives evolution. Well, what is a mutation? Let me give you an example. So if we were going to copy this sentence, the big brown dog barked a lot, and when we copy it, we end up with the big brown dog baked a lot. Well, there's only one variation there, and that's we missed the letter R. That's a mutation. And in the copying of genetic information, of DNA information from one generation to another, the billions of base pairs of DNA information, in the copying process, a mutation is when something gets left out or it gets changed. But to use that as an engine for positive evolutionary change is kind of going against the grain, because mutations are mistakes, and mistakes are not what you use to make things better. Dr. John Sanford, who's an expert in this field, said, indeed, beneficial mutations are so exceedingly rare as to not contribute in any meaningful way. Sanford concludes that the frequency and generally harmful or neutral nature of mutations prevents them from being useful to any scheme of random evolution. So the engine itself is not getting, in theory, you might could go from a human to a bacteria over time by continually losing genetic information, but you certainly cannot go from a bacteria to a person, because you had to add more genetic information. It just does not fit reality. And number 6, and this is kind of the transition into our next section, which I'm a lot more excited about, the evidence of a creator. But evolution contradicts the order, design, beauty, and information we observe everywhere in the universe. Doesn't matter where you look, it all looks designed. And evolution contradicts that, where to believe in evolution, you have to constantly remind yourself, I don't believe it's designed. I don't believe it's designed, no matter how much it looks designed. Let me give you one example of this, of how it's seen everywhere. Let's get into something really small. We're going to talk about proteins for a moment, but I want to illustrate this in this way. Pretend, if you would, that I've got this massive mountain of Scrabble letters on the stage here, an equal number of each letter. Now, we can figure out what is the mathematical probability of me randomly selecting Scrabble letters and spelling the word chance. The way we would do that, it works pretty simple. There's a 1 in 26 chance of getting the C, a 1 in 26 chance of getting the H, and so on. So you'd multiply 26 by 26 by 26 by 26 by 26 by 26. So the chances of spelling the word chance randomly is 1 in 308,915,776 times. So we already are at a point you think, that's probably not going to work very well, right? But it's possible. But what if we were trying to spell this randomly? The Lord's Prayer. We are now in the realm of impossibility. It can't be done randomly, accidentally. It must be done purposely by an intelligent being who selects the proper letters. It's the only way you can get there. Well, now let's use that illustration and talk about something in real life. Proteins are the building blocks of life. They're built by amino acids. There are 20 amino acids that code for protein. So to get a protein, you have to have a string of amino acids, and you've got to get the right one every time. Well, you can mathematically figure out some formulas here. So to get a simple protein of 150 amino acids long, so you got a chain of 150 of them, 1 out of 20, 1 out of 20, 1 out of 20. So you multiply 20 by 20 by 20, 150 times, and you come up with the chances of getting this simple protein accidentally are 1 in 10 to the 164th power. How big is that number? Well, here's an idea. It begins to get you on the right understanding of this. It's estimated the number of atoms in the whole universe is 10 to the 80th power. Now, so at a glance, you might say, well, okay, the top number is about twice as big as the bottom number. No. To go from 10 to the 80th power to 10 to the 81st power, you got to multiply by 10. To go from 10 to the 81st power to 10 to the 82nd power, you got to multiply by 10. By the time you get to 10 to the 164th power, and the number of atoms in the whole universe is 10 to the 80th power, you realize we're definitely well beyond the realm of impossibility to get one simple protein accidentally. And yet then add to that, the average size of a protein in the human body is about 300 amino acids long, not 150, and there's tens of thousands of different types of proteins that are being produced. Here's one example. Hemoglobin is 539 amino acids long. This is the chance, if you figure it out mathematically. I don't remember if I did that or somebody else did it, but look at that number. This is what the chances of accidentally getting hemoglobin would be. 4 times 10 to the 619th power. Evolution is not an explanation of how life came about. You can't get there without an intelligent designer. It's too complicated. We see design everywhere we look. And so it violates the second law of thermodynamics. It violates the law of biogenesis. It purposely confuses microevolution with macroevolution. The fossil record contradicts evolution. Mutations do not bring about increased information, and evolution contradicts the order, design, beauty, and information we observe everywhere we look. And so we can see that evolution has some major problems. By the way, we have memorization cards on our website. They're free. Just download them. You can memorize those 6 scientific flaws as well as the other things we're going to talk about today. So if you're interested, you want to memorize what was those 6 things, I want to get those memorized in my mind, you can get these cards on our website.